Like the show? Help support the Sunday Stoic by rating us on iTunes. Volunteer to read, suggest content, or send comments to sundaystoic@gmail.com. Thanks, and carpe diem.
Justice, temperance, wisdom, courage. Applying ancient philosophy to modern times, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Today's guest is Dr. William Irvine, professor of philosophy at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. He is the author of On Desire, Why We Want What We Want, A Slap in the Face, Why Insults Hurt and Why They Shouldn't, and several others. His book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, introduced me, and I'm sure many of our listeners, to this philosophy. Dr. Irvine, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, and pleasure meeting you, Steve.
Thank you. The first thing I noticed when reading your book, one of the first things you mention is the importance of adopting a life philosophy. And that really spoke to me because that's what I was looking for. But in this age of distraction where you can go down a rabbit hole of YouTube videos, social media, etc., why should someone take the time to self-reflect and read various philosophies and actually pick one out to adopt in their own life?
It makes sense to give it some thought and pick one out because it'll have a huge impact on the quality of your subsequent life. And most people don't realize you can pick one out. They assume that everybody else has already given it thought and picked one out. And so they assume that if they adopt the same values as the people around them adopt, that they're going to be happy, which is kind of strange. Because if they looked at the people in question, they would realize that many of them are anything but happy. And that's because they have the default philosophy of life that members of our species do. We're biologically programmed to want to be rich and famous. Now you have to kind of qualify what counts as rich, and rich primarily means more affluent in some measure than the people around you. And famous means that there are any number of people who love and admire you, and you know what? Admiration is more important than being loved. And yet, you can look through history and you can find any number of cases of people who were both incredibly wealthy and incredibly famous. You know, you take kings and so on who are miserable as human beings. And that alone should make you think twice about just following the crowd. And all it takes, it really is not a huge thing. It's a weekend project to kind of get yourself up to speed on this notion of a philosophy of life, and then to at least, and this is what I encourage students or encourage people to do in Guide to the Good Life, is I say, you know what, Stoicism is one of those philosophies of life that you could conceivably choose. There are others. And you know what, you can give Stoicism a very low-key kind of try. You can try out some of the fundamental strategies, and you can see whether that's working on you. So it isn't like you have to go and take, a year's worth, or if you're a Buddhist, 20 years worth of lessons on how to do it. Give yourself a weekend and give yourself part of a week, and you'll know pretty quickly whether it's making a difference in your life or not.
How did you then start practicing a 2,000-year-old philosophy that was mostly dormant? People have read the Stoics for a very long time, but I think when you started practicing Stoicism, there was not a movement like there is today, where there's Facebook groups with several thousand members and things. How did you find this philosophy, and how did you start to practice it?
Well, I was a philosophy major in college. This would be back in the 1970s. And as a philosophy major, we did encounter the Stoics, but we encountered Stoic logic, which is one of the things they were interested in. We didn't get into their advice on how to live. And that's because back then that was thought not to be the proper realm of philosophy. We were supposed to do dry technical things. So I found that kind of strange, but followed along in the path because I wanted to have a career in philosophy. Ended up, so this would be 15 years ago, kind of realizing that maybe it was time, it's getting late in the game, maybe it was time for me to adopt a philosophy of life. And I kind of looked around and I decided that Buddhism would do it for me. So I set about researching Buddhism, and as an academic, I'm always on the lookout for twofers, that is two for the price of one. So I thought one thing I could do is write a book about human desire, because that would not only give me a chance to explore Buddhism in detail, but it would also turn into a publication, which is beneficial, for your progress in academia. And then the surprise came when I looked at Buddhism, and the more I found out about it, the more I realized that it would not come to me naturally, that I would literally need to invest years, maybe decades, in order to see any kind of a really basic result. And if there are Buddhists listening in, they'll say that's not fair. But that's the conclusion I drew. And in the process of writing this book, I realized that I needed also, for balance, to describe other possible philosophies of life. And so Stoicism was among them. And then it dawned on me that it was what I was looking for. So I came to it in a kind of a backdoor way. And what happened was I noticed I was practicing Stoic strategies in my everyday life without kind of consciously saying, okay, now I'm going to do Stoicism, for the next 7 minutes. But I just realized, what I just did is actually because I've fallen under the influence of the Stoics.
And when you first started practicing this, I assume that was shortly before your book came out, or how long had you been practicing before the Guide to the Good Life was released?
So that would have been the book that turned into, was called On Desire, Why We Want What We Want, which I think came out in 2006. So before I was done writing that book, I would have been a practicing Stoic. Then the thought was, maybe there are other people out there who don't know about this and who would benefit from being introduced to it. And at the same time, the Desire book, the book on desire, did pretty well for an academic book. And then I thought, but a book on Stoicism, unfortunately, nobody's going to buy it. But let's see if I can pull over a fast one on Oxford University Press and see whether I can talk them into letting me write this book on Stoicism. And they said yes. I had a very good editor there, very responsive editor there at that time. I still have a good editor there, but this was the woman who kind of read the manuscript and said, yes, that this is what we want. And it has just far and away outstripped, in any way you want to measure success, any other book that I've done. And it comes as an absolute astonishing surprise to me. So it turns out that there is this kind of deep-seated need for philosophy of life, and that Stoicism, I don't know if it works for everybody, probably doesn't, but it sure works for a whole bunch of people. So I get emails from them, and it's very interesting, and it's wonderful, and yet utterly unexpected.
Well, I greatly appreciate the book, and I wouldn't be talking to you, obviously, for a variety of reasons, if not for that book. And I do recommend the listeners check out The Guide to the Good Life. It's an excellent introduction to Stoicism. But it came out around 9 years ago. Has your practice of Stoicism evolved in that time? Has it changed much in that course of time, or not?
The basic Stoic practice is the same as ever. I mean, I do notice people assume he's the guy who wrote a book on Stoicism, so he'd be like the ultimate Stoic. But I'm not. I'm a human being, and I find myself backsliding. I find myself starting to take things for granted, and then I get wake-up calls. Sometimes the world will be really, really nice to you for an extended period of time, like weeks, and all you're getting is good news and surprise good news. And then you start thinking, I'm immune to the normal problems that normal people have. And it's just the Stoic God setting you up for a knockout punch. Because when it finally comes, because you've only experienced good things for that period, it's really going to be painful and disorienting. So now, I know now when things are going really well that I'm being set up, and that I practice my negative visualization. I try to imagine what things would be like. I guess another thing I've noticed is I've started thinking that I can contribute something to Stoicism, that we shouldn't regard it as a dead kind of document, that it's been perfect. That's how people treat the Bible. If somebody wrote a new chapter for the Bible, the Christians would say that doesn't count. It's all been sealed. I don't think that's true of Stoicism. So I've attempted to come up with things that I think are extensions of Stoicism, that if the Stoics could be brought to modern times, would not only say, yeah, that's a good idea, but they would also say, by all means, if you got a good idea, if you got a way to enhance Stoicism or make it more relevant to modern life, then go for it. They didn't regard theirs as the seal of the prophets, right? Where we've said it, and now that's the end of it. It's actually psychology, and human psychology is fascinating, and you can watch how other people think and how other people live, and then you start thinking in terms of is there anything I can say or do that can deflect where they're headed to in life? And that may sound pompous. Who am I? Who am I to be telling other people how to live their lives? Well, I don't tell them. But, there are times when you can make a difference in somebody's life. And if you can, then you should. You should try.
So speaking of the premeditation, I guess it's premeditatio malorum if you go back in time far enough, the negative visualization. Adam, a listener to the show, asks what your top 3 regular practices are.
Negative visualization would be right there at the top. And it's so easy to do, and it's so effective that I get a very big return.
As a Stoic, negative visualization is your top number one way to practice Stoicism on a daily basis. What about just like a running Stoic commentary? I think you mentioned in your book. Do you try to keep a sage in the back of your head that says, what would a Stoic do?
Yes, I don't think I have kind of an internal Stoic. It's now been it's become second nature for me. But what I do notice, and I watch myself. See, it's an interesting thing. So if you want a kind of enlightenment, step 1 is watch other people. But that's easy to do because other people are other people, and you can laugh at them, and you can think what fools they are. But then the next level up in your own practice is to start watching yourself. So I've internalized a lot of Stoicism, and I don't even think of it in terms of, okay, now I'm going to do a Stoic practice number 12 or whatever. It's habit now. But then what I do is I watch back. I watch myself, and then I can see that I actually have backslid, as I described before, that things that I should be doing, I'm not doing. And it's easy to do. I mean, we're human. And like I say, when things are going well, it's easy to get complacent about what you're doing.
So a negative visualization, and then perhaps like an evening meditation over how you've performed that day. Would those be 2 good practices to start with then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the meditation is not Buddhist meditation. It's you just thinking, hey, my day, how did my day go? And what part of that day am I responsible for it going the way it did? And that can go either way. You can realize, oh, you know what? Something good happened. And the reason it happened is because I didn't let something bad bother me. So, for instance, if somebody insults you, the Stoics have a extensive body of advice on how to deal with insults. And they say, if you're hurt by an insult, you're to blame because you let it hurt you. And you shouldn't have done that. And then the other thing in the meditation is when things go badly. So when things go well, you can reflect on that. When things go badly, you can reflect on that, just as a kind of a reminder to yourself of, well, what would a Stoic do under those circumstances, or what should I have done differently? The human, maybe I'm taking my mind as a standard mind, but I find myself, I do have a tendency to dwell on some things, to dwell on some incidents in the past. And now, at least when I do it, I feel so stupid because it's pointless. And why let the past contaminate the present? And yet it's there. And so I acknowledge those thoughts in me and try to think of a productive workaround for those thoughts in those situations. A lot of people they live in the past, and that's really unfortunate because you can't change the past. You can change the future, and you can start with the very next second that you live. You can change that second. It can be dramatically different than it was going to be. It's going to require some thought, some effort on your part. So,
thank you. Catherine Wilson has a question relating to this as well. How is negative visualization better than a gratitude practice? And she follows up, how do you visualize without catastrophizing or losing the moment of joy?
Look, there are other people who do what the Stoics are doing in negative visualization, so they aren't alone in doing it. And in fact, Christians, if they understand prayer properly, do a form of negative visualization in their prayers. So a lot of people think, oh, what is a prayer? It's you asking God if you can please win the lottery next week and things like that. But that's one form prayer can take, but a much better form is thanks, prayers of thanks. So Christians who actually in some cases turn out to be kind of closet Stoics, or they're they're doing Stoicism without realizing there's a name to it. But even those who aren't, if they're doing those prayers of thanks, are doing a form of negative visualization. So we don't claim to have a monopoly on this. We don't even claim to have invented it, but we're out there saying, hey, you know what, here's something that you can do. Second part of that question was
how do you visualize without catastrophizing?
Yeah, well, to visualize is a brief flickering thought that you allow yourself to have about how things could be worse, and I have no trouble at all doing that, and I can visualize about, really truly catastrophic kinds of things, about the end of the world, about the laws of physics breaking down, meaning that the universe ends. I can do that. And but then it's a flickering thought, and you know what? Then the next day when I wake up and I realize my glasses are still there on the nightstand where I left them, and there's still a white ceiling over my head. It's bizarre, but that's a little moment of it's delight, a moment of delight where, you know what? The world could have ended overnight, but it didn't. And what does that mean? I get a chance, another day of life, another day to try to get it right. And then, of course, backstep and say, well, but the day might not last 24 hours. So I'm going to go through this day. I'm going to take it a minute at a time. So I have zero problem doing that. There are people, though, who might have a bigger issue. There are people who tend to think negatively. You give them any situation, and they'll try to find the bad in it. and give any situation, and they'll try to think of the ways it can probably go wrong. And that's an important thing to do. I mean, you should plan for the future. And it's the interesting thing, the ability to think about those things without simultaneously coming to dwell on those things. So the suggestion is practice, practice, practice. But it is conceivable that there are some people whose psychological makeup is such that they would find it very difficult to do negative visualization in a meaningful way.
Another listener has written in, John, and he has a kind of a long question, but I'll paraphrase. I think it brings up the dichotomy of control. John says he sees people quoting the Stoics to avoid personal responsibility. So we know that in the Enchiridion, Epictetus says there are things under your control and things that are not under our control. And he says many times he sees people focusing on that latter part, there are things that are not under our control, as an excuse to remain idle in a given situation. Is that very Stoic of them?
First thing to realize about self-professed Stoics is that a significant portion of them I wouldn't regard as practicing Stoics. They're people who are learning how to quote Stoics as part of some kind of social statement. It's like getting a tattoo, only instead of having to pay for it and having it there in your skin, you get to talk that way. So I would say that the mere fact that somebody can quote Stoics is not evidence that they are what I would call somebody who's adopted Stoicism as a philosophy of life. And the other thing is, that the claim Stoics take enormous responsibility. I mean, you look at Marcus Aurelius. He was not only the Roman emperor, but he was a good one who cared about how things were happening. And so, by no means, if you look at the actual Roman Stoics, they took responsibility for very many things. And then within that realm of responsibility, though, they were very careful to think about what they could make a difference in and what they couldn't make a difference in, and realize it's pointless to spend your life trying to do things where you aren't going to make a difference, but to focus those energies into things where you can make a difference is the duty of a Stoic, the social responsibility, and I agree with that. We talked a second ago. There are times in life where you simply can't change. It's a bad situation, and what do? You rough it out and you go on. And there are times when it's interesting. Small things can make big differences in the world. And so you're kind of on the lookout for those cases and try to take advantage of them when they come. And by take advantage of, I mean fulfill one's duty. That's what's involved in taking advantage of it.
So could you describe then your trichotomy of control in relation to dealing with situations like that?
Okay, so that's one place where I've updated the Stoics, because they said there are things you can't control and things you can control. And I said, actually, if you think about it more carefully, among the things you can control, we would have two subdivisions. There's the things you have absolute control over, and then the things that you don't have absolute control over but can have an impact on. So you actually end up with a trichotomy of control instead of a dichotomy of control. Things you absolutely can control are your thoughts, are your values. Those are things you have choice over. But in A Guide to the Good Life, I use the example of tennis, right? So tennis, there are things you can't control. You can't control how well your opponent prepares. I mean, unless you're cheating, I don't know, drug him or something, but you can't control it otherwise. And you can't control it absolutely. I mean, there's nothing you can do that will guarantee that you win. So what do? You simply do what is in your power to do to the best of your ability. So you train as well as you can. You adopt the maximal strategy. You play as hard as you can. And you know what? If you lose, it isn't really a loss, because the part you had control over, you did to the best of your ability. So this coming weekend, I'm scheduled to be in a rowing race in Columbus, Ohio. And the interesting thing is, and I tell my fellow athletes this, and they think, oh, it's such a cop out. But I say, you know what? I'm actually not racing against the other boats in the race. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy to beat people, but my real race is against myself. So for me, the whole rowing thing is about self-development, self-discipline. It's a wonderful practice in life where you're doing something hard. How come? Because it's hard to do. And a lot of people just wouldn't understand that. They would say, well, shouldn't you just be comfortable? Shouldn't you just relax? Well, that's one approach to life. But you know what? I'm in training when I row, and not only for upcoming races, but I'm in training for life. Because someday life is going to present me with a significant challenge. It's going to happen. And then the question is, will I be ready for it? So an analogy you can use, it's like a fireman who spends all of his time training. Why? Well, because someday there's going to be a fire. And when that fire comes, he wants to be ready for it. He wants to be able to deal with it effectively. He wants to be able to put it out. Well, even if you aren't a fireman, you're a human being, and life is going to present you challenges. And the question is, are you going to be ready? And if all you've done for the last few decades is be comfortable, it's unlikely that you will be ready, because some of these challenges will involve a considerable degree of discomfort. I mean, if you get sick, there are things that can happen to you. So you prepare for the worst, and while trying to soak every ounce of delight that you can out of the days that you have.
Excellent. Now, one last question. It's a big picture question. Let's say this catches on like wildfire. How would our society be different if everyone became a practicing Stoic? How would you see the world changing if that suddenly caught on?
I suspect there would be, number one, it's never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So this is a very counterfactual kind of question.
All right.
And the reason why is that just most people are sucked up in this game they're going through of just trying to extract not delight out of their days, but pleasure and avoid pain. And everybody they know is doing it, so they're going to do it as well. But I suspect that to the extent that people are switching over, and I'll put this in broader terms, to the extent that people are finding a thoughtful philosophy for living, will make them happier individuals. And Stoicism happens to be one of those. So the suspicion is that the world would be a happier place. There'd be fewer of these negative emotions floating around, less hatred, less anxiety, less fear than there is now. So that would be the principal benefit, a happier world. Now, who could argue against that?
I think that sums it up. Dr. Irvine's book, A Guide to the Good Life, is an excellent book to learn how to extract delight from everyday life. I highly recommend our listeners check it out. Bill, thank you for joining the Sunday Stoic today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
My time is my time, and my mind is my mind. Wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage I'm trying to find. There are few things in this world that I can control. I'll focus on those few and I will let the others go. And when the world rises up and seems to keep me down, go.